In this beautiful, uh, beautiful poem of loss, maybe the best known of Dickinson's love poems, the speaker moves through a series of states of being, of existing, proposed existing with her beloved, and then finds each one barred to her. Since she cannot live or die, be resurrected, be judged by God, be lost or saved with Him, they must meet apart, quote unquote, in a place which is paradoxically defined as small and vast at the same time. And it will be nurtured by, again I quote, that white sustenance, despair. In each hypothetical rejected vision of meeting, the speaker unflinchingly, unhesitatingly juxtaposes the intensity of their love with the rather limiting reality confronting them. In the first stanza, the poet rules out the possibility of actually living with a beloved. And she rules this out on the grounds that it would be life, and life is over there behind the shelf. Now, read in isolation, the lines have the half bitter, half resigned quality found in a large number of Dickinson poems, in which the speaker acknowledges both desire, hunger, yearning, and deprivation as a primary condition of her existence. And we can find an echo of this stance, of this attitude in some other major poems, like God gave a loaf to every bird. You can check up this poem, or Victory Comes Late, and who never wanted maddest joy. These are the titles of the poems which you can refer to, in which a very similar stance is taken. The stance being that satisfaction and fulfillment are out of reach, are not to be attained, are elsewhere, not here, and may be withheld from her. However, as the first and the second stanzas are joined by the enjambed lines, behind the shelf the sexton keeps the key to, another meaning of life is over there emerges. For the porcelain is of course taken from the text, a church sexton locks up, is the vessel used for the ceremony of wine and bread of the Lord's Supper. So the life behind the shelf may thus refer to life eternal, which is symbolized by this Christian ritual. The speaker implies that she cannot live with her beloved because that would be life, a fulfillment in a way which challenges God's paradise. And hence this tension between earthly life lived here, and eternal life lived with the God, in God's purview, in God, in the shelter of God. This tension runs throughout the poem. One of the biographers of Emily Dickinson, Cynthia Griffin Woolf, that's the entire name, Cynthia Griffin Woolf, she puts it rather wonderfully in her book simply titled Emily Dickinson. She writes, the very nature, I quote, the very nature of the lover's excellence is a force that might disable God if it were permitted to exist. I repeat, the very nature of the lover's excellence is a force that might disable God if this earthly lover is permitted to exist. Dickinson used the image of a porcelain life, quote unquote, porcelain life earlier. She wrote a letter to Samuel Bowles, Samuel, Samuel, Bowles, Bowles, Samuel Bowles, the editor of Springfield Republican, and she was very reverential about him. And in this letter, she asks about his and his family's health. And explaining her anxiety for them, she writes in the letter, I'm quoting, this is a letter written in late August 1858. Dickinson writes, I hope your cups are full. In such a porcelain life, one likes to be sure that all is well, lest one stumble upon one's hopes in a pile of broken crockery. I repeat, quote, I hope your cups are full. In such a porcelain life, one likes to be sure that all is well, lest one stumble upon one's hopes in a pile of broken crockery. It's a letter written, as I said, late August 1858. Of course, Dickens is here taking the psalmist symbol of life overflowing with blessings. My cup runneth over, taken from the Psalms. And then she transforms it into a very complex image of both mortality and the destruction of romantic hopes. Possibly her romantic hopes for Samuel Bowles, because she was rather fond and reverential of him. So in the light of all these associations, the sexton, putting up our life, his porcelain like a cup, becomes a deity who's indifferent to human happiness. Not only is the cup fragile, it is devalued by the keeper of mundane orderliness, discarded of the housewife, quaint or broke. The notion of broken lives, broken hopes, is carried forward in the final evolution of the crockery image when Dickinson says, a newer severs, please, old ones crack. Of course, severs refers to the quality of porcelain, a very well-known brand of porcelain. A new one is required, the old ones crack, which suggests, of course, that the lover's relationship is an old one also. Now, having thus explained why she and her lovers cannot live together, first part, the speaker goes on in the next two stanzas to say why they could not die together. Maybe die together perhaps in a sort of suicide pact, And the critic Vivian Pollock suggests in her book Anxiety of Gender this precise point, that the possibility of a suicide pact between the two lovers is always there. But then that is also not done, not to be done. Why? Because here the barrier is that, the difficulty or the problem is that, I quote from the poem, one must wait to shut the other's gaze down. That is, one has to perform the ritual of closing the eyelids of the deceased. And neither would be capable of watching and doing it or capable of waiting to do that. You could not, she tells her beloved. But whether this inability would stem from excess of sorrow or grief, or because maybe he's much older and thus likely to die first, or some other reason, that is not made clear in the poem. But this thing of waiting to shut the other's gaze down, this the beloved cannot do. You could not. And as for the speaker, seeing him die, if she has to see that, if on the reverse, so on one side, the man may be older, the person may be might have this inability to close the gaze, the eyes of the narrator, because again he's very old, or he's too full of grief, and maybe he will die first. On one side, on the other side, if she dies, if he dies first, seeing him die would be impossible for her without dying instantly herself, because she claims for herself the right of frost, where the right of frost is a sort of equation for death. The critic Judith Farr, F-A-R-R, Judith Farr, has written that this poem's, I quote, dark and harrowing logic has made it a model of poetic argument. Dark and harrowing logic has made it a model of poetic argument. And the key word here is poetic. For it is difficult to see any simple logic in the argument of these stanzas, or conventional logic in the argument of these stanzas. Logic in the sense of Aristotelian logic, or logic which is the operation of a rational mind. But the operation of a poetic mind, yes, poetic is that's why poetic is an important word. Since neither lover could wait, they might indeed die together. And then, of course, more in addition to this, Pollack writes, there is no compelling reason why a corpse needs to have its eyes closed, unless she's implying that she needs help with dying, and that her lover would be incapable of murder. For Pollack, the only way to see the stanza as internally consistent is to make this assumption, conjecture, that the real problem is not her inability but her unwillingness to die herself or to cause her lover to do so. She doesn't want to die, or she doesn't want a lover to die too. This is reading in a of course great deal, and it seems simpler to assume that logic is secondary here, traditional logic, to the logic of emotion. Emotional logic, poetic emotional logic is more powerful. The speaker's simultaneous convictions that she could not live a moment if her beloved were dead, but that any shared experience, even the transition from life to death, would be denied them. In all her poignant explanations of why she and her lover cannot be together, the deep, immobile or immovable conviction of the impossibility of love's fulfillment, this almost always precedes argument and precedes as evidence. It's always first there, that they cannot ever be together. There's a sort of, as I said, a deep, fixed conviction of the impossibility of them being together. This almost as if always already arrives and shapes things beforehand. The next two stanzas, 6 and 7, they form the hinge upon which the verse turns from earth to heaven. Dickinson has a number of poems in which she anticipates a sort of reunion in heaven. A reunion in heaven which is done when a reunion is denied, or a union is denied on the earth. Because there is a union denied on earth, there is a reunion on heaven. Thus, in a related poem which was written in the previous year, there came a day at summer's full. There came a day at summer's full. She describes the renunciation of an earthly love, but then anticipates a union which is beyond the grave. She writes, that new marriage justified through calvaries of love. So that new marriage which is again eternal and heavenly. But here she devotes 6 stanzas to naming the obstacles to a reunion in heaven. Nor could I rise with you because your face would put out Jesus's, that new grace. Just as in girlhood, Dickinson found herself loving the world too well to declare for Christ during the Calvinist revivals, which regularly swept through Amherst, where she lived. I mean, she could not. She always. It was always as if she loved the world too much and could not wholeheartedly declare a love for Jesus equivalently in her girlhood days. So, very similarly in this poem, she rejects Jesus' glory as an inferior substitute for her earthly lover's glory. And the lines resonate with a very brief letter that she sent around 1877 to Samuel Bowles, about whom I had talked earlier, a very handsome, radiant Samuel Bowles, and who is by many scholars assumed to be the beloved that Dickinson is talking about, the beloved of this poem. And about Bowles, there was this, everybody knew that he was a very sort of active, relentless social activist. And despite ill health, he was not very well, he was not very healthy, but despite that, he had extraordinary energy and zest for all forms of social activities and activism. And that sort of gave him, in Dickinson's eyes, a sort of aura, a halo of saintliness. Apparently acknowledging the receipt of a photograph, which was perhaps sent by Samuel Bowles to her, she writes that this is the brief letter that I'm talking about. You have the most triumphant face out of paradise, probably because you are there constantly instead of ultimately. I repeat, you have the most triumphant face out of paradise, probably because you are there constantly instead of ultimately. This is letter number 489 from her collected letters, in which she writes this to Samuel Bowles. Now, as Judith Farr makes a note here, the vision of the lover's face eclipsing Christ's face, this recurs in the image patterns of the letters and the poems that Dickinson wrote to the man whom she called Master. Within quotation marks, Master. The letters are addressed to the Master. Sorry. Without the radiance of her beloved, except that you than he shone closer by. So the radiance of the beloved is not there. She continues, she would be homesick in heaven. Homesickness, of course, we should note, tormented the homebound Dickinson, whether on earth or in heaven. And pertinently, relevantly, she wrote in 1862 these lines, I never felt at home below, and in the handsome skies I shall not feel at home. I know I don't like paradise. Here, she is homesick for the life that never could be, so ordinary, domestic life infused with the radiance of his love. Then too, she writes in stanzas 8 and 9, even if this happens, judgment would come between them, since although the beloved tried to serve heaven, she as his idolater could not. Why? Because you saturated sight, and I had no more eyes for sordid excellence as paradise. I'll stop here.